Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Vicente Diaz wash processed El Salvador from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Sweet Bloom, based out of Lakewood, Colorado. And longtime viewers might remember that Sweet Bloom was once one of our most featured coffee roasters on this channel before they made the transition from the San Franciscan to the Loring. And since then, they've not featured as much, mostly because I haven't enjoyed their coffee as much. But I did know that at some point we were going to go back and revisit their coffee. Unfortunately for me, they've lost multiple Coffee of the Month polls, so I decided that we would just purchase a coffee that sounded good to me. And that's where this El Salvador comes into play, as not only does it sound like my type of coffee, but I have made it a point to review some origins that have not featured much on this channel this year. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 26. And this cup right here is actually brewed with the automatic coffee maker, but the recipe we went with was based off of Sweet Bloom's information on their website, which has changed over the course of the last year. This is the first time I've looked at their brew guide on their website in about a year. Previously, it was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, but now they opted for a 17 to 1 water to coffee ratio with no indication on the temperature. So we did fluctuate around with that a little bit, but we settled on our standard temperature, which is 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I did like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee is a little interesting, as this is arguably the most developed coffee I've ever had from Sweet Bloom, as this one was very much in line with what a lot of people would associate with a medium profiled coffee, as this one was very far along in the development spectrum. So that's to say, yeah, quite developed, much more closely in line with a medium than anything else I could describe. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 6, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and that's the first thing I noticed was the development. And I really had to kind of think back on this as to whether or not Sweet Bloom's always been this developed, and my profile, my palate has just shifted a little bit, but I'm like, I don't think that this feels right. It just feels much more developed than I've ever experienced from Sweet Bloom's coffees. I should also say that even though they haven't featured much on this channel, I still try them like every month, every couple of months, because there are enough coffee shops around the area that serve them. So I've actually never experienced this from one of their coffees, but that was really noticeable. That being said, there was a fair bit of fruit brightness for what the coffee is, which was a pretty developed El Salvadorian coffee. In addition to that, the pineapple was feeling notably present, as the coffee offered some really nice potential. So I'm like, you know, it may be a little bit more developed than I was expecting, but we're going to see what we might be able to get from this. Day 8 ran it through the Chemex, and the coffee was already cashing in on that potential, as it was surprisingly fruit bright, yet again, with a fair bit of a sweeter citric aspect present in the cup. Even more surprising, there was an abundance of fresh peach, so I was kind of shocked to get that sort of experience from it. I do have to say though, the entire cup was marred by a fair bit of smokiness, but it continued to remain a lot more fruit forward than I was expecting. Day 11 through the April brewer, and there was more of that fruit brightness at the forefront, as it radiates an abundance of those fruit forward aspects. Citric components were at the forefront of the cup, with that listed pineapple being a very notable and prominent thing, with a nice peachiness in the finish. Smoky quality of the development still plays a significant role in the overall experience of the cup. But for the most part, it had been pretty sweet up to this point, pretty fruit forward, and I said, you know, I can probably overlook this one thing because I'm getting enough of the other things to justify it. Day 13 lowered the temperatures. I attempted to see if maybe this would change the overall results. Opted for the Chemex, and there were pros and cons of it, because the slight smoky aspects were toned down, but it was also at the cost of the fruit vibrancy. So it did open up a little bit as it was cooling, with a bit more sweetness, but for the most part, I was honestly just struggling with how developed this coffee was. Day 15, same adjustments with the V60, and once again, it's my biggest note that I have for this day, and that's once again the smoky qualities of this coffee, as there's a fair bit of fruit brightness, but it does continue to leave that very strong roasty smoky quality throughout. Still a fair bit of a focus, this time on a smoky dark chocolate aspect, so not necessarily my favorite. We continue on to day 18 through the V60, once again with the lower temperatures, and I said I don't really know if this trade-off is worth it. I deleted the recipe as well. The fruit brightness is there, but it's not overly direct anymore. So while I was experiencing a somewhat noticeable abundance in the earlier days, the more I worked with this coffee, the less it was present in the cup. It's also trended backwards in terms of the citric brightness. So even then I'm losing on something that wasn't necessarily my favorite, but it was at least something that was different from the experience I was getting from this coffee. Day 20, full circle, back to our standard recipe, and I felt like the trade-off was worth it because I was just getting that brightness that I kind of needed to really cut through that very smoky aspect of this one. Fruit vibrancy is a little bit more present than it had been in the past, but unfortunately, those first 3 days are the best day I'd experienced from this coffee, and those were all really marred by that smoky quality. A slight bit more bright with a fair bit of the smoky dark chocolate yet again. Day 23, final notes we have, one line of notes because I ran out of space. Ran it through the V60, citric forward profile, and a very heavy, robust smokiness. It is better as it cools down. Here on this day, it's improved as well as it's cooled down, but for the most part, it's been really inconsistent in that sense as it's had a lot of those smoky qualities, and as a result, the fruit hasn't necessarily shined through as much as it had in some earlier experiences. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so that's the finish right there. And that is unfortunately the very strong, smoky, lasty, roasty quality of this coffee. It does linger a fair bit, and as I took that sip, I'm like, I know that I'm going to be tasting this coffee for a fair bit, unfortunately. So that quality isn't necessarily my favorite in any sense. Let's discuss the 4s that we do have, because we have quite a few of them. Florality, level 4. Interestingly, that's not something I've discussed too much while making this tasting wheel, but I do think that they have a floral note listed on here, which would make a lot of sense. There is the florality kind of hidden underneath the very strong, robust, heavy chocolate aspect of this one, and it did linger a fair bit too within this cup. It's one of those things that's maybe just secondary to a very strong and robust profile. That being said, it did justify that level 4, as most of the things in this coffee are at least pronounced, mostly because this is just a very strong coffee to begin with. Citrus fruit, level 4, yes, and the fruit brightness that I was experiencing towards the end was much more in line with the citric aspects to it, and I wish I could have gotten maybe a little bit more defined of a citric attribute to this one, but unfortunately not. The pineapple that they have listed on here felt a little bit less defined and a little bit more generic in terms of that citric direction, though it is a slightly sweeter citric component. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, and that's to be expected with a Central American coffee, but that being said, I didn't necessarily go into this one expecting it to be this strong and this defined in this coffee, but it was very heavy and it really seemed to kind of encapsulate the overall experience of this one. Right alongside the other thing that we do have listed at that level 4, which is the smokiness, and obviously I wasn't the biggest fan of that. Level 4 is extremely high for any coffee, so that was attributed to the roast profile of this one. Again, surprisingly more developed than expected going into it. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the body level 3. Yes, even with all of the things I've said, it was slightly lighter bodied than I might have expected, and that one I attribute possibly more to it being with the Chemex as well as a more diluted recipe. So that in one sense is, medium level, but at the same time, you might have expected it to be, well, a little lower based off of what we were using. In addition to that, cleanliness level 3. Yes, if there's that strong of a smoky quality, then there's no way I could justify scoring a level 4 for a wash processed coffee, especially considering it was taking away on the overall definition of this coffee. So level 3, unfortunately, seems about right for me. Sweetness, level 3. That's surprising to me. I don't really know if this coffee was brewed with roasted with the Loring, or if it was roasted with the San Franciscan, because I do know that they still have both at the roastery. But that being said, I don't recall having too many Sweet Bloom coffees in the past that have scored that level 3 mark. So that's kind of surprising to me. Maybe if I would have scored it on the earlier days, that one right there could have been at a level 4. But the more time I gave this coffee, the less sweet it became, and it might have been me tinkering with this one as much as I did, but level 3 for that. Acidity, level 3, kind of interesting because it still had a fair bit of brightness, and I think most of that was because I was trying to ramp this up to maybe get a little bit more from this coffee. So level 3, yes, and bitterness, level 3, that's going to actually unfortunately be coffee bitterness, and I remember when making this tasting, I'm like, take a note that it's actually the coffee bitterness that's present within this one because it does have that very strong roasty coffee quality to it. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I was really surprised by the way that this one turned out because, as I've kind of mentioned, I've been monitoring and tracking Sweet Bloom's progress since they made the transition. And I still have not had a coffee that ended up like this, so I'm not entirely sure what happened with this. But I have heard from others that some of the other coffees, like the Key or the Vicente Diaz as well, from other people, came out a lot more developed than they remember from Sweet Bloom. So I don't know if this has been maybe a bit more of a recent transition, because before this, I think it's been maybe 2 months since I last had one of Sweet Bloom's coffees. But it really took me by surprise just how developed this coffee was. So that in itself did kind of take away from what I was expecting and what I was hoping for from this coffee. And that just kind of negates the entire experience I'd had with the argument between the roasting machines that they are using, because regardless of which machine they were using, this isn't my profile sort of coffee, and it's not really what I remember or expect from Sweet Bloom. So this one just honestly came out of left field, and I'll be completely honest and say it was a little bit more disappointing than I was expecting. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, we must start with the profile. So you do need to enjoy your more developed coffees in general, because that's the first and biggest point I needed to start with on this coffee. It did have a fair bit of the smokiness, a fair bit of the more traditional coffee components to it. So start off with that if you do enjoy the more, we'll say, classic, traditional, crowd pleaser sort of coffees and a much more developed profile, while still offering a nice contrasting fruit brightness, because there were some positives to take away from this one, and I was seeing glimpses of what Sweet Bloom once was, and that's with the very strong sweet fruit aspects that are present in something like a El Salvadorian coffee. So credit to Sweet Bloom in that sense, but as I kind of mentioned, not necessarily my thing, but that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Vicente Diaz wash processed El Salvador from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.